I am Halston Bennett, 62 years old, and for most of my life I have lived in a small cabin tucked behind a row of pines at the edge of a quiet town. People say a home reflects the man who keeps it, and maybe that is true, because mine has always been simple, steady, and a little worn from years of long days and longer nights. I raised my son Kelson Bennett alone, starting from the day his mother left with nothing more than a short note and a promise that she would call. I spent the next 3 decades working in repair shops, fixing old engines, and trying to make sure Kelson never felt the absence I carried in my chest. When he grew older and drifted into a life that shined brighter than anything I had ever known, I told myself that distance was a sign of success, not a sign that I no longer fit in his world. The wedding invitation arrived on a late afternoon when the sun had already slipped behind the trees. It sat inside my mailbox like a message from someone I barely knew. Thick paper embossed letters, everything about it elegant and cold. There was no phone call before it arrived, no check in no moment, where Kelson said he wanted me there. The envelope told me the date, the location, and the attire, nothing more. I stood in my kitchen, turning it over in my hands, thinking about the years when I packed his lunches, patched his clothes, and showed up to every school performance. Now I was being informed rather than invited. I drove to the lakeside resort on the morning of the ceremony, my old truck carrying me past rows of polished cars that sparkled under the light. The resort rose above the water like something from another world. Glass walls, white stone paths, and guests dressed in shades that looked expensive even from a distance. My suit felt stiff on my shoulders, and for a moment I wondered if people could see the rental tag that had brushed against my neck when I put it on. I walked toward the entrance, reminding myself that I was Kelson's father, and I had a right to be there. Inside, I saw him standing with members of the Lowell family. He was tall, confident, and smiling in a way that made him seem older than his 32 years. When he caught sight of me, he nodded once and turned back to the group. It was a greeting that lasted no longer than a breath. His bride, Lysandra Lowell, approached with a polite smile. She wore a dress that shimmered when she moved, and her voice was soft but detached as she said she was glad I could make it. Her eyes flicked over my suit, my shoes, and then back to my face with a judgment so light it could have been mistaken for curiosity. I had seen that look before in people who lived in a different world, but pretended to offer a hand to those below. The ceremony took place on the lawn overlooking the lake. Guests sat in rows of white chairs, and I found mine near the back, where the sound of the water almost drowned the vows. Kelson did not turn around once. After the ceremony, the reception hall opened with music and laughter spilling out from gilded doors. A hostess guided me to a small round table tucked beside the service corridor, where staff hurried in and out with trays held high. From that seat, I could see Kelson across the room, moving with ease among the Lowells, shaking hands and sharing quiet jokes. He looked like he belonged there. I looked like a man who had wandered into the wrong celebration. Dinner service began with plates carried out quickly to the front tables. Those tables sparkled under the chandeliers, but mine remained bare long after others had finished half their meals. When a server finally arrived, she set down a plate of cold salmon, limp vegetables, and potatoes that had started to crust over. She apologized and said the kitchen had run short. Before I could lift my fork, I heard Kelson's voice drifting across the room as he spoke to a group of his friends. He gestured in my direction as he said that I was used to whatever was left. The group laughed in easy agreement. I sat still, feeling the room blur slightly as something inside me pulled tight and quiet. I wanted to stand to speak, to remind him who held him through fevers and heartbreaks, but the words stayed in my chest. I ate the cold food in small bites and kept my eyes on the table, letting the weight of the moment settle over me like a familiar shadow. The music softened as the reception shifted into the parent dance, and I stayed in my seat near the service doors, while a spotlight formed a pale glow across the polished floor. Guests moved aside to make room for Kelson and Lysandra as they stepped out with matching smiles. When the next song began, Lysandra's father joined her, and Kelson reached for her mother, with the confidence of a man who believed he belonged in their world. I watched them sway in graceful circles, while the crowd clapped along. No one looked in my direction. The chair beside me stayed empty. I pressed my hands together and tried to tell myself that the distance I felt was imagined, but the truth settled across my shoulders like a slow weight. A woman with silver hair and a dress that shimmered softly in the lights made her way toward my lonely table. She introduced herself as one of Lysandra's great aunts, and she asked if she could sit with me for a moment. Her voice was warm, and her eyes held the kind of understanding that comes from noticing what others ignore. She said she preferred quiet corners, and that she hoped I would not mind the company. I told her I did not. She looked toward the dance floor and said that families are complicated even on days when they pretend otherwise. There was no judgment in her words, only a gentle truth offered without expectation. For a few minutes the noise around us faded, and her presence made the space feel less hollow. When the music changed again, she squeezed my arm and said she hoped the night would not weigh too heavily on me. I watched her join her sisters near the dessert table, leaving me alone once more, but the moment of kindness stayed with me. Soon the speeches resumed, followed by toasts that grew louder, as the room filled with laughter. I sat quietly until I realized I could leave without disrupting anything. Kelson was busy with his friends, and Lysandra was surrounded by relatives who adored her. No one would notice if I slipped away. I stood up and walked toward the doors, keeping my steps light. The air outside felt cooler, brushing against my face, as if inviting me to breathe again. The resort grounds were quiet, under a sky scattered with soft stars. Lamps lined the stone path in small pools of yellow light, and I followed them slowly toward the parking lot. With each step, I felt a part of the evening fall away like dust shaken from an old coat. The drive home passed in a blur. I did not play the radio, and the dark road stretched ahead, like a long ribbon guiding me back to myself. When I reached my cabin, the silence inside felt deeper than usual. I hung my jacket on the chair and sat at the small wooden table where I had eaten countless solitary meals. I opened my laptop and the familiar glow lit the room. I pulled up the bank records that showed every monthly transfer I had made to Kelson since he left for college. I remembered the nights I worked late to cover those payments and the times I skipped things I needed, so he would not feel what I felt growing up. Kelson always believed those deposits came from a trust left by someone he barely remembered. He never asked how the money arrived, and I never corrected him. The lies shaped our life in ways I had not understood until now. I stared at the numbers on the screen and felt something inside me shift. It was not anger, it was not even sadness. It was the sudden realization that I had allowed my own life to become small, so his could feel larger. I opened a new email and began typing words that felt unfamiliar in my hands. I told him I was ending every form of financial support. I wrote that the credit line I opened for emergencies would be closed. I told him I planned to sell the piece of land he assumed would someday be his. The land had belonged to my grandparents, and I had held onto it through storms. Debt and quiet years when selling it might have solved every problem I faced. Now I needed it for myself. As I typed, another truth rose to the surface. Years ago, when his mother walked away for the last time, she told me I would have to make up for her absence. I promised her I would, and that promise dragged me through decades of giving until I could no longer tell duty from love. I whispered that promise to myself for years, believing it made me a better father. Now I understood that it only kept me from seeing what I had become. The email grew into a letter I never imagined writing. When I finished, I read it twice. Then I pressed send and let the quiet of the cabin wrap around me. For the first time in a long while, I felt awake. The morning after I sent the email, my phone filled with messages from Kelson. The first note sounded casual as he said, I misunderstood the jokes at the wedding, and that everything had been harmless fun. A few hours later, his tone shifted as he insisted that ending the financial support was unreasonable, especially now when he and Lysandra were planning their future. By the end of the day, another message arrived with a trace of panic. He said payments he depended on were failing and that I needed to reconsider. Over the next 2 days, the messages became shorter and heavier until they carried more fear than anger. I read each one in silence and finally stopped checking the phone. 2 days later, a car pulled into the gravel outside my cabin. When I opened the door, I saw Lysandra standing there in a neat coat, with an expression that mixed tension and resolve. She asked if she could come in, and I stepped aside. She walked into the small room and looked around as if she were seeing my life for the first time. She said things had become difficult for Kelson, and that he had been carrying worries she believed I never knew about. She explained that he had grown up ashamed of his childhood, and that every success he chased came from the fear of being judged by her wealthy family. Her voice wavered slightly when she said he was terrified of being seen as someone who came from less. I told her I understood the fears people carry, but I also said I could not continue rescuing a man who refused to stand on his own. She asked if I had considered giving him more time. I answered that time had never been the problem. The problem was the pattern we lived inside. She looked at the framed photos of Kelson as a child and said she knew he depended on me far more than he admitted, but dependence had turned into a wall neither of us could see past. She left soon after, and when her car disappeared down the road, the cabin felt strangely calm. That week I sold the land that had been handed down to me and used the money to leave the life that had grown too small. I drove to a quiet coastal town and rented a small attic apartment above a hardware store. I found part-time work repairing fishing equipment and settled into a rhythm that felt peaceful in a way I had never expected. I spent my evenings walking along the shore, letting the sound of the water smooth out the parts of me that had been tense for years. One late afternoon, as the sky shifted into soft orange light, I saw a thin figure waiting near the pier. It took me a moment to recognize Kelson. He looked worn down, the kind of tired that comes from carrying a burden alone for too long. We sat on a bench overlooking the water, and he told me he had come because he finally needed to understand why our lives had grown so far apart. He said he believed for years that I worked long hours because I was ashamed of being a single father left behind. He thought my silence meant regret, and that he needed to prove he was better than the life we once shared. His voice shook as he said he spent years running from a story he never understood. As he spoke, I felt a slow ache move through me. All those years of distance had grown from a misunderstanding neither of us had seen clearly. The truth rested between us like something fragile, and for the first time I felt the weight of the past begin to loosen in the evening air. We met the next morning in a small coffee shop near the harbor where the windows looked out toward the open water. The place was quiet at that hour, and the soft sound of cups being set on tables filled the gaps in our conversation. Kelson sat across from me with his hands wrapped around a paper cup, as if he needed its warmth to steady himself. He said he wanted a chance to start over and that he wished we could go back to when things were simpler. His eyes held a mix of fear and hope, and for a moment I saw the boy he used to be, the one who waited for me on the porch after school and believed the world was safe as long as I was near. I told him I cared for him and always would, but I also said I could not return to the life where every decision I made was shaped by his expectations. I said that we had both been living inside a pattern that kept us from being honest with each other.